Welcome, everyone. This is Julie Colgan with DTI Epic, and strangely, I'm at a hotel in Miami, and I just lost the internet. So I can't see the slides. I certainly hope you can. Wanted to start out with a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, welcome to our second in our series on auto-classification. This one, we're going to talk about creating structure from unstructured content. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. For many of you who know, I spent 3 or 4 years at Nuix, kind of focused on this kind of challenge, and excited to share Sandy Circus with Valora and what they're doing around this topic as well. So we have another guest with us today, Karen Frazier, who is part of the DTI Epic team as well. So really excited to share some thoughts around how to go from I don't know what I have to I know what I have and take some actions on it. Just some housekeeping items. We are recording this session, so at the end of the session, we will send out a link to the recording to all of those who registered. So if something goes wrong, like it did for me, and you get booted off the internet and you can't see the slides, don't worry. You'll have an opportunity to view them later. Also, we're going to have some time, hopefully at the end, to take some question and answer live. We'll get to as many as we can. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to type in your questions in the control area, and we'll get to those at the end. But certainly do enter them as you're inspired so you don't forget about them. Sandy, anything else that I missed on my housekeeping items?
The only thing is that we're going to be running a couple polls throughout this. There's one running right now, just kind of asking where you're from or what your organization is. So if people could just vote on that when they come up, and then I can share the results with you kind of throughout.
Great. That's great. So I'm going to try and get back on the internet. So while I'm doing that, Sandy and Karen, maybe Karen, do you want to start with an introduction so people can get to know you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Karen Frazier, and I have worked in the legal environment for over 20 years, both directly for law firms and as a vendor. I joined DTI in 2016, and I currently work with clients across the country to evaluate their RIM and IG programs and develop roadmaps to help them reach their goals, whether that be through retention execution, transitioning to an electronic environment, application evaluation and migration, or process improvement. I previously developed and performed client implementations of disposition processing software, accessing multiple data sources within a firm to unsilo siloed data, which really revealed the full picture of retention-eligible content across a firm's holdings. I also performed record software migrations and custom data synchronizations for clients. In my roles with a law firm directly, I developed almost 100 electronic business process workflows, including new business intake, and developed and managed the data synchronizations between firm applications. Sandy?
I don't know if I can top that, but I'm Sandy Circus. I don't know everybody on this webinar. Just so people know, there are about 85 people attending right now. And in a moment, I'll kind of share with you where we all come from. For those who don't know me, I'm the president and CEO of Valora Technologies. We're very excited to have just celebrated our 17th anniversary at Valora. And if you're not familiar, we are the makers of a system called Powerhouse that does AutoClassification, which is kind of a very clever way to understand what files and content contain, and then to be able to take actions on that. So those capabilities have ramifications for information governance, records and information management, e-discovery, and just kind of ethical management of data in general. So we're going to kind of cover a lot of ground on that today, so I won't spend too much time on it. Happy to talk with anyone who wants to learn more about me offline. I'm just going to share the poll so you guys can see who's here today. So we got a nice mix between corporate, law firm, and consultancy, kind of the bulk of it, and a handful of other things as well. Let's proceed.
Awesome. Hey, Sandy, I got back on the internet, and I'm back on the webinar so I can see the slides. Yay.
Great.
Yeah, so just, yeah, good. So just a little setup here. We had a similar slide on our first session. And by the way, if there are folks on here who weren't able to join the first one, please do go back and take a look at it. There was some great information that we shared. But here, we're talking about enterprise information in 2018. We all know the reality that we're looking at. There is stuff everywhere, and it's growing at an alarming rate. Lots of words used to describe it. Dark data has always been one of my personal favorites, because in reality, so much of it is just unknown. We can see that there are a lot of things, but we don't necessarily know what those things are, and maybe most importantly, what they mean to our organizations, both positive and negative. We're seeing proliferation, not just in our own servers and in our own office space, but as more and more organizations, particularly for the law firms on the webinar, as we see organizations adopting cloud and putting some things up in public or semi-private clouds, it's moving the problem to another location. It's not taking it away. So it may be adding in some new challenges. So this conversation is about how do we start to get our arms around what this stuff is, so we can make some decisions about it and then ultimately take some action on it. And in particular, looking at the challenges around unstructured data. So I think we wanted to start here with level setting around what is unstructured data versus structured data, so we can all make sure that we're on the same page. And as Sandy then goes through and Karen share some experience around solving that problem, I don't know what I've got. So Sandy, you want to go to the next one?
Certainly. Today's webinar, which if you weren't kind of following all this, is part 2 of a 4-part series. So today we're really going to focus heavily on structured and unstructured content, mostly unstructured content. So we thought it would be helpful to kind of start with some definitions. So in case people are unfamiliar, unstructured content is by and large the bulk of files and information that we work with as business people and as legal and attorneys on a day-to-day basis. The typical unstructured content are things like email, attachments. This PowerPoint is an unstructured data file. As I said, it's by and large what we work with each day, and it's by and large what has accumulated over the last 20, 25 years of us being essentially kind of a digital economy. And that is what is kind of taking up everybody's file shares and enterprise content management systems and cloud storage. That is the bulk of what is kind of out there. So that's unstructured. Structured content, the best metaphor for that is a database. It's specifically content that has structure to it. So that usually manifests as some sort of database record, and there's like ancillary information, kind of like metadata, that lives with the content. I'm going to show you some examples of that in a second. This is a fabulous definition from TechTarget on what exactly is unstructured data. Again, if you're a typical kind of office worker in the late 20 teens, you live in an unstructured world. This was a great definition from Webopedia, and together this should give you a pretty good picture of unstructured content. By contrast, structured content, probably the best metaphor is to think about a database, whether you're familiar with a CRM system like Salesforce, or you're using some kind of ERP system like PeopleSoft. Any of those systems that have that database kind of feel to them are going to be structured content. A very good B2C example of structured content is online shopping. If you think about Amazon or any other website where you're bringing something up, in this case a book, and you can see here, here's the structured data, the price, the ISBN number, the publication date. This is the structure. And the big difference between this and unstructured content is nobody has gone ahead and done this work. Sometimes they've done it by hand, but it's sort of ad hoc. And that's the fundamental difference between structured and unstructured data. Again, here's a great definition from TechTarget. If you're ever wondering about any of these terms, and we're going to be tossing a lot of them out we'll try to, use definitions where possible. But TechTarget maintains a fantastic vocabulary. So if you're ever kind of confused and you don't want to look dumb, just check out TechTarget on the side. So why should we care? Structured, unstructured, blah, blah, blah. Well, here is the growth of content storage by type, okay? And I've purposely hidden the legend here so you can try and guess. One of these, yellow or blue, is structured content, and one of them is unstructured content. So you can guess. Let's see if you guessed right. The blue, which is having explosive growth, is, of course, the unstructured data. Why? Because we're constantly emailing, texting, creating information that doesn't have a lot of structure to it. Where our database usage, it's growing, but it's a very modest growth rate, and it's fairly well controlled. So structured data generally isn't the issue for enterprises. It's unstructured data. And in case you didn't notice, this is written in exabytes. Pop quiz, what's an exabyte? It's a billion gigabytes. If you thought a gigabyte was a lot of data, try exabytes. And you'll notice this taps out in 2014 because we're all waiting for IDC to redo their survey. But you can imagine what the subsequent years look like. In fact, here you go with the projection of that. This is what we are going to look like in 2020. Again, you can see that just unbelievable logarithmic curve in the growth of data.
Hey, Sandy, real quick. This is Julie.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make note on that same study. I'm a huge fan. I am waiting for them to do another one. But in their last iteration of that, the Digital Universe study, that's IDC, you can see down at the bottom of this slide, an interesting aspect of this growth is the ownership and responsibility for its management. So they estimated on that study that about 2/3 of the digital universe is in fact created by consumers. So me individually, you individually, but in reality, 85% of it is, at least in part, the responsibility of some sort of organization, whether it's a government entity or a corporation, a law firm. So for example, I create my account at Amazon, and while I created it, it's now Amazon's problem to manage it. So understanding that it's not just a lot of stuff, but this stuff has meaning to us and meaning to our partners and our customers. And so we have an obligation to ourselves and everybody else that we do business with, and perhaps even in the interest of the public trust, to do something about it.
Right, and for those that are kind of following the legislation, let's say coming out of Europe with the GDPR, there are very strong penalties to not dealing ethically with data that you're holding on behalf of consumers. I think we're going to be seeing more and more types, variations on that theme, because the data, as Julie said, is ultimately in the hands of parties that are responsible for it, not necessarily in the hands of the consumers that created it. All right, now we have a pretty good picture of, how the data is growing. It's growing exponentially. Everything's exponentially, exabytes, meaning large. And we know that the bulk of that is unstructured data. So what do we do? What does AutoClassification, which I kind of talked about in my intro, what does that bring to the table to kind of help out this scenario? Well, AutoClassification is the bridge. It makes unstructured data structured. So remember that structured data has kind of essentially metadata or fielded data that describes what's happening, what the structure is. So it'll tell you what something is and certain attributes, maybe a date it was created or a date it was last used. All of those things are kind of a very rich definition of the concept of metadata. The folks on the phone who are from eDiscovery are quite familiar with metadata. You've seen it. If there's anyone not, what metadata really means, it's data about data. That's the meta piece. And so what it is essentially attribute information that tells you something about the content of a document or a file. So the most easily understood piece of metadata is typically date. So what date was this content created, or what date was it last modified, or what date was it sent to so-and-so. And there are hundreds and hundreds of different types of attributes. structure that can be put on or around unstructured content, almost all of them in some way require some variation of text and or metadata, and that gives us context for the file. Julie or Karen, want to talk a little about context?
Yeah, so when we talk about context, it's really, we have the text, we have the metadata about the text that tells us when it took place. It really tells us how we're supposed to be categorizing this data. What does it mean today?
Yeah, I mean, context is king, right? We used to say content is king, but then we got a bit more sophisticated and realized once we got things into at least semi-structured ECM systems that context really is the thing that tells us the answer that we seek. Just because I know that the word contract is in an email doesn't really tell me whether or not that's a record. It's really understanding who sent it and who sent it to whom, what the rest of the words in that thing mean, whether there's an attachment to it, what format that attachment's in. So all of that rich information pulled together gives us the ability to make a decision about it. So just text extraction or generating text from things that aren't text bound is the first step, but then really getting an understanding of what it means is where we've got to get to.
So let's talk about the first part of that equation, text. Some of the more obvious ways we can get text are from the body of a document, like a Word or Excel file, PowerPoint, email, any other type of document that's textual in nature. We get it directly from the name of the document. Also, we can get it from the file path that tells us where a document is stored. We can also get text from fields that are added to PDF files or overlaid on image files. But there are other types of files that can give us context that do not contain text. Images themselves may contain text, maybe a street sign or a billboard or the graphics on a t-shirt. Then there's scanned paper in JPEG, TIFF, or flat PDF format. What about audio files, like a voicemail message or a soundbite? Video files, like recorded deposition or a webinar like the one we're on right now? And what if we have text, but it's in another language? How do we create usable text from these sources? Sandy will explain how Powerhouse can ingest these sources to give us the text we need to generate metadata that will ultimately give us what we're after, context. Sandy?
Okay. So the first one, and again, kind of the folks who are familiar with eDiscovery will understand this piece of the equation. How do we get text? Well, if we have a native file, ESI, which stands for electronically stored information, generally considered to mean electronic files that were born digitally. And so, like a Word file or an email, how do we get the text out of that? There is typically some sort of text extraction process that happens. Most files have three parts to them. They have the text itself and metadata, if there is any. Some electronic files do have metadata. There's kind of simple file metadata, like the day it was created or the application used. But some things like email have their own built-in metadata, like who sent it and what time was it sent and received, and through all the various hops that it made from start to finish. So there's kind of a text and a metadata layer to a file. This is for ESI now. There's usually some sort of picture or image, kind of graphics, fonts, formatting. If you've ever looked at any HTML code on purpose or by accident, you know what I'm talking about. And then there's kind of what I would call coordinating code, which marries those two pieces together and says, put the picture here centered in the middle, or make these words bold and, blue. So there are kind of components to a file. And when we want to get at text, we kind of focused in on that with this process called text extraction, which literally sort of lifts the text out of an ESI file and puts it in a very easy to work with format for systems that want to mine the text to do things like create rich metadata. Okay, we kind of covered that. So here's actually, let me back up. I thought I had a PDF to show you. I was going to show you kind of the Powerhouse data sheet and just kind of show you a few carrots on our website. You can look at it. And what I did was essentially extract out the text. You can see this is kind of boring ASCII looking text, but this is the content that shows with lots of pretty graphics and beautiful layout on our Powerhouse data sheet. So that's kind of the fundamental difference between pure text versus the straight up ESI file, which in my case was a PDF. So this is what it looks like. And you've seen this sometimes. If you open up a PDF and you kind of highlight, sometimes you're able to highlight text and you can kind of cut and paste that into something else. And sometimes you can't, because PDF has a lot of different formats. Sometimes it has rich text underneath. Sometimes it doesn't. This is generally what it looks like when there's text underneath. And if we do this text extraction step, this is generally kind of what it looks like. Okay, so that's what we do when we have ESI. We extract text out of a native file. So what do we do when we have a scanned page or many, where we basically have images? So for those who don't know, when you scan a piece of paper, what results is an image. It's almost like a photograph. The typical formats are TIFF, JPEG. There are a few others floating around out there. But what you have is essentially a bunch of pixels, black and white pixels. You don't really have text, even though it looks like text to somebody reading it. So there is a technology called OCR, for optical character recognition, that literally kind of tries to interpret those pixels and kind of make an intelligent guess, really, as to what the character is underneath. So I'm going to show you a little bit what that looks like. Essentially, it's kind of looking at the black versus the white and the sequence of that and coming up with the probability of a character. And then once it goes kind of character, 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 it starts to string them together against a dictionary to kind of form words. So it comes up with a T and then looks like an H and then an E, and it goes, aha, the. And so that's how OCR works. There are dictionaries that help it find, if I got THK, that's probably not a word. Something's not right there. So, and this stuff is fairly old technology that's kind of almost in the public domain already, but there are ways too to kind of soup these things up. For example, if you are working on content that has a specialized subject area like finance or construction or employment, there are kind of specialized dictionaries for those disciplines that, again, kind of help refine the results of OCR. And so here's a really good example of how an OCR engine works. So it's looking at this black and white kind of coloring on a grid, and it's kind of estimating that, boy, this sure looks like an 8. So this is just a quick little way for you to understand what's happening underneath when we say OCR, what's happening when we're going from scanned images to rich content. This is a step along the way. So now we have, and Karen mentioned a couple of other scenarios that can sometimes be challenging if you're trying to work with text, which is what most, kind of analytical systems today, including Powerhouse, want. They want the best possible, the richest possible text. So we talked about ESI, how we extract that text. We talked about what happens when we have scanned images. Now let's talk about when we have documents that are not in English, or you just want to do in some other language. So what we're going to describe here is called auto-translation. You've probably seen it if you've ever been on a website and Google comes up and says, would you like to auto-translate this? The same type of technology taking place there, where documents kind of come in whatever their native language is, and depending what, kind of settings you have, they kind of come out in English. So it's an English rendition, a word-for-word rendition. It's not the same as a native speaker, translating Chinese, but it's a word-for-word, kind of best shot translation. It's very, very low cost. So there are a lot of benefits to doing that. One, if you don't speak the language, you now have a fairly good English rendition of what the content says. And in the case here for auto-classification, you now have a viable kind of baseline for the systems to do their analysis, to build metadata, to build rules, and say, oh, okay, this is what this document is trying to say, and therefore these are the steps we need to take to manage that content. So there's a lot of different benefits to having auto translation kind of in the mix. I usually ask this as a question, but we got a lot of people out there today. We're up to 102. But you can guess amongst yourselves, anybody know what this is a picture of up here, this map? If you don't know, it is a language map of the world. So for example, red is English. You can see it, obviously in the US, South Africa, Australia. So it's just a fun little thing to kind of really hammer home just how many different languages are in use. This is the dominant language in each of these places. And if you're, dealing with, or you are a multinational organization, chances are you're dealing with multiple languages. And so to have that fluidity in auto translation is really a big bonus. So the last one that Karen mentioned is what happens for files that kind of have text sort of embedded in them, but they're not, a written out document in Word or something like that, like an audio, like this recording, for example, or a video where the text is sort of embedded along with the imagery. So what happens is, essentially, this is what they look like. If you've never seen what a WAV file looks like, that's what they look like. You have your typical kind of video clips or pieces that you have. Same thing, they kind of go into the system and they come out. There are various options. You can do time sequencing like this. You can just do a straight up text rendition. And you can sometimes, if you want to kind of format it as, a deposition or transcript, that is something that can be done as well. It's sometimes called auto transcription. It's sometimes called speech to text. That's what kind of the techies will call it. Those are all the same things. And again, very helpful, adding structure here, you can see it, to unstructured data. Very common use case. Just in case people don't understand how this works, again, this is a WAV file. Each one of these little blips is what's called a phoneme. A phoneme is a little bit like a syllable, like faux and neme are both phonemes. And so just like the OCR is kind of translating and trying to assess the black and white pixels, speech-to-text software is trying to interpret the WAV file and the pieces of the WAV file. Just a little of my background, obviously I used to work in this industry. So something like this one right here, I can tell you is an N because of the long tail on that. So people who really know what they're doing can read WAV files. I'm not nearly that good. I can recognize my name. But this is what the software does, algorithms underneath, like if you've ever worked with IBM Watson, it has a speech-to-text engine that is able to parse this, to read this, and present up a text rendition of what it says. Okay, so now that we understand how to get text and all these different ways we get text from different types of files, we're going to kind of switch gears and say, okay, I got the text part, get me to metadata. Because metadata is going to tell me about the file, and not just this file, but all the files. And if I have 20 terabytes of stuff, I don't want to be looking through every single file. I'd like the metadata to do the work for me. So here's the step now that how we go from text to metadata. So for example, the word contract, as Julie mentioned, that's a pretty specific type of word. It tells us a lot. The good indicator of what this probably is. So the document type is almost certainly a contract. So now I have a piece of metadata that tells me what kind of document is this? Because up until now, all I knew was it was a PDF. Now I know it's a contract. And if we were really fancy, we'd know it's an actuarial services contract. Here are some other examples. What's the effective date of the agreement? Very helpful information. It's starting to sound a little bit like a database, isn't it? We've got metadata, kind of fielded information that is telling us the attributes of this content. And we might be able to take important steps. As Karen mentioned, we might want to look at things like, what's the retention policy for a contract, or one that has an effective date of 2005, or is between these parties, and so on and so forth. So with AutoClassification, you can kind of pull out anything that might be of interest in here that helps you with your decision making about managing content.
Yeah, quickly, Sandy, I'll just mention, managing content is more than just applying retention policy, right? There's all kinds of reasons why you might want to create some structure out of unstructured data. The contract one is a great example. I know, a lot of corporate entities use contract management systems and have teams of people who do that. And so to have a technology that can actually create the structure that could potentially auto-populate into a contract management system, that saves a lot of time and energy and potentially reduces the risk of errors and omissions in transposing the information into the system. So, be thoughtful and creative about what you could actually use all of this good metadata and context that you're generating for all kinds of different management use cases.
So how far can we go with metadata? Well, the answer is we can get pretty detailed. This is a pretty detailed document. It's a patent application for the USPTO. There's tons of useful information in here, which would become metadata. This, again, just to give you a feel, all of these are fair game for an auto-classification engine, and pretty much anything you see here. So what people who start to get involved with auto-classification, what they quickly come to realize is, wow, I could have 20, 30, 50 fields of information for different purposes, as Julie said. It might be kind of a risk mitigation strategy or ethical treatment of data, but it might also be for a very proactive kind of knowledge management data mining. What can you tell me about all of our historical information? What trends or forecasts can we make by data mining the information we have? So the richer and thicker that your metadata gets, the more insight and protections that it provides. So these are just a bunch of examples of the kind of rich metadata that auto-classification can create for you. Powerhouse supports about 600 different fields of metadata, and Karen will even talk with you about some that most people have never even heard of.
Yeah, we've got hidden metadata. Most likely you find them on mobile phone photos. So you've got GPS tags, dates, software marks on images from mobile devices. It's really cool. We can identify the specific location where a photo was taken and even the name and type of device that captured the picture.
Okay, so we have both metadata that's kind of out in the open and hidden metadata. Okay, we thought it would be helpful for all of you, now that you kind of understand, so far we've really kind of covered the basics, structured, unstructured data, how we get to text, how we get to metadata, and as Julie described, why that gives us so much context. So we thought it would be helpful to take you guys through the thinking and the planning that goes on in a typical project. So we've created for you this project checklist, and Karen's going to kind of walk you through the things that we recommend that people think about when they're beginning to work on a kind of auto-classification type project.
Yeah, so when you start a classification project, answering these questions will set expectations and keep the project on track and in scope. First, of course, you need to know what it is you're trying to accomplish. Is it freeing up storage space, deduplicating data, normalizing your data structure? Knowing your end game is going to inform your plan. How much data is there? Is it a targeted data set or your entire organization's world? Depending on the volume, the plan may need to be adjusted to address it in chunks. What does the data source look like? Is there already a well-defined or even loose structure that will aid in categorization of the contents? What's the format? Is it paper, electronic, a mix of both? If paper's involved, a plan to capture the data in electronic form will definitely need to be worked out. Is everything in English, or is there content that will need to be translated? How precise with the categorization do you need to be? Auto-classification can be configured to an appropriate threshold of confidence. The higher the threshold, the more evaluation required, meaning more time required. Are there any regulatory or compliance policies or guidelines that will need to be taken into consideration? What about litigation? How soon does the project need to be completed? And what's the budget? Typically, these go hand in hand, as more resources are needed to complete a project in a faster timeline. Sometimes you can get creative on the budget if the investment can provide a net gain position or return on investment in a certain period of time. Who are your stakeholders in the project? What do they care about? Money? Time? Consistency? Accuracy? Finally, how do you measure success? By answering all of these questions, you've provided a means to measure the project. So what kinds of projects is AutoClassification being used for? Here's 10 on the next slide. Actually 11.
So Julie, maybe you want to speak to some of these, or?
Yeah, it's interesting. We used this slide in the first session, and we actually did a couple of polls. One at the beginning, of laying out a simplified list of use cases, and asked which of these is the thing that most represents the stuff you're working on or are concerned about. And then we asked it again later at the end of the session, and it changed a little bit, but these are ones that, for those of us who've been in this business a long time, see over and over and over again. Migration is one that I see happening a good bit. Certainly technology is changing rapidly, and so organizations are taking advantage of that. And then the process to actually, move stuff from one place to another is a great opportunity to invest some time and effort in classification to make sure that you're setting up this new system for success. Remediation, I would probably lump some of the other things that are on this list into that. I put orphan data, for example, into that. Orphan data are things that are left behind when people leave organizations or move to a different function, but essentially it's lacking the ownership and the insight to make some decisions about it. Upgrading is similar to migration, in the technology-driven opportunity. Security, compliance monitoring, litigation investigation, I put those into similar buckets where there's some external authority that has some interest in how information is managed within your organization. And so it certainly behooves an organization to know as much about the data as possible so you can be compliant at a minimum level, but then proactive in an ideal sense where we're actively securing information based on what the information actually is, rather than just trying to build super deep moats and really tall walls, because we've all learned that bad guys are they've been incentivized to learn how to swim across deep and wide moats and scale really tall walls, so they'll do it if there's a reason to do it. So again, it's the insight that we can get into our data now through technologies like Valora's Powerhouse is opening an entirely new world to information management professionals to get ahead of the game, even at scale. That's been, I think, the last 5 years or so has been the challenge. We've amassed a huge pile of stuff that we don't know what it is, and we have lots of different use cases that's represented here. But the future is bright if we are bold enough to take advantage of the technology that's available, and we're creative enough to use it in a way that generates value.
Okay, so we have kind of picked what we think is a kind of very common, a very telltale sort of use case to sort of walk you through, which would be an M&A, what we're calling loosely an inheritance project. So what we mean by that is there's always some sort of merger or divestiture type of activity where organizations are coming together and data is being inherited from one party by the other. And when that happens, it's usually a lot of data very quickly, and it's sort of like dumped on the legal team. Here you go, it's now your problem. And so you have this kind of inheritance issue of, good Lord, what is all of this and what do we do about it? And so we're going to kind of talk you through how to handle that scenario.
Yeah, it's a really hot topic these days. So this is a project that has a pretty well-defined scope, whether large or small, and it all starts the same way. You just inherited a bunch of file shares and you have no idea what you'll find in them, and you need to assimilate them into your organization as quickly as possible so business can continue as usual. Once you've answered all the questions from the checklist that we spoke about, you can begin work on the project. Start by prioritizing the data to control the volume of data that's being processed. Is there a particular department or business area that's a top priority? Typically in a corporation, the priority would be on sales, HR, accounting, and key business lines. In a law firm, we would see accounting and HR in hot practice areas. You would also want to make sure to put a focus on any area where there may be current litigation, investigation, or regulatory concerns. Breaking the data down into chunks makes the project more manageable, allows you to be more nimble with your approach to each area, and brings you successes much sooner. How long would it take to boil the ocean? We can do it much faster in smaller batches. So once we have our first chunk of data to work with, what's next? So we'll start with triaging the data, or what we call early content assessment, or ECA. This identifies and segregates rot, which is what we call redundant, outdated, or trivial data, and also the much more easily identifiable vital or litigation hold data. Typically about 60 to 65% of data is remaining after this. This 60 to 65% is the data that we know it's important, but we don't necessarily know what it is. Is it current client versus past client in a legal environment? Or is it active versus discontinued business line in a corporate environment? And we don't know if it meets the disposition requirements of our retention policy, if we have one. And if we don't, this can help inform the creation of a retention policy. So this is the percentage that we need to further assess. Starting with ECA eliminates a large chunk of data from processing, making the more in-depth second pass much more efficient. We can use ECA to lay out a straw man to help us move forward. It will tell us what is good and bad about what we have to work with so far, and it will help us determine what information is missing that we need, like not being able to segregate out a certain chunk of data that we're interested in. We use the deeper dive second pass to try to tease out all of that missing information we need. Of course, we start classifying using the existing organizational structure available. This is where you want to bring in your SME on the targeted data, whoever has the most knowledge about the content. Black Cat is the perfect tool for analyzing the data. It is a business intelligence tool that can slice and dice the data in many different ways to provide a tremendous insight into the kinds of data you have. After you've worked with the SME to decide how you want to classify the data, you're ready to set up your rules. This is the heavy lifting of actually reorganizing and classifying the data. And we'll talk about rules in detail in our next session, so please join us for part 3.
Excellent plug for our next webinar. Okay, so that kind of brings us up to our closing comments. Both Karen and I have some thoughts for you. These are mine. Probably the number one thing that I'm constantly saying, and whenever I speak all over the country, is that text and metadata, people try not to use the phrase magic bullet, but I'm going to use it because that is going to take you from that unstructured world into a structured one. And now you can work with your files and your content in many, many different slice and dice kind of ways that are basically impossible or not an option if you don't go through some sort of step to get at text and metadata. We talked you through it today, how it's done. It's actually surprisingly easy. It probably takes us more time to describe it to people than it takes for these processes to run. Just to give people sort of an order of magnitude, half a terabyte, a terabyte, these are things that can be, bashed through in a day. And so if you have, 20 terabytes of data sitting around, we can really kind of scale up the processing power and get you fabulous information in relatively quick order that would never compare to sitting there and opening up each file and looking at it. You'd be there for the rest of your life. So that's why I am going to go ahead and use the phrase magic bullet. Not that it solves everything, but it is just orders of magnitude better than not having it. The other big thing that people, I think, are really starting to understand now is that you can tame the beast. And what I mean by that is you can get your arms around enterprise content. For a long time as a society, we sort of just buried our head in the sand. We're just like, well, too much data, no one will ever get control of that. That's not really an acceptable position anymore. It's not really even an ethical one. And so you can tame it. You just need some tools at your disposal that can do the work other than you. If you're the records manager or the information governance person, it's not your responsibility to sit there and look at everything. That would be impossible. With a bunch of tools, though, you can kind of affect that by getting this abstracted metadata layer to kind of tell you the lay of the land. And then finally, we didn't quite mention this when we were talking about starting off projects or indicative projects. One of the things that we strongly recommend is to do a pilot or proof of concept, POC, first. It's relatively short money. It's going to be quick to implement, and it can set you up for an early win. If your goal is ultimately to kind of get control of the entire organization's information strategy, you can start with a department. You can start with a specialized use case, have a big win there, and let everybody see the results of that. And in our experience, what tends to happen is the next group will raise their hand once they see that. They'll look at the success of that pilot and say, oh my God, please, can we go next? And they'll volunteer themselves. So that's our recommendation rather than trying to do the whole enterprise up front. Karen?
Oh, so my takeaways here, we can get text from just about anywhere. So just know those difficult files, they can be unlocked and you can get the context that you need out of them. Next, have a game plan. Use the checklist we mentioned to make sure that you're not overlooking anything or creeping out of scope. A consultant can be really, really helpful here.
All right, so that takes us to a plug once again for the final two pieces of our webinar series, which will be in March and in May. Also, I think all three of us are going to be at Legal Tech later this month. If you want some more information, we're happy to speak with any of you. And I thought it would be good for us to run another poll, and then we have some questions that have accumulated, and we'll take a moment to answer those. So I'm going to put up another poll for all of you. Here we go. Please take a minute and tell us your most pressing data need. We did ask this in the last session. It'd be really interesting to see whether that has changed from then till now. And again, I'll put the results up after most of you have voted. And while you're doing that, I'll sort of plug our next one, which is going to be about rules, where we're going to get really down and deep with what auto-classification rules look like, how you use that metadata to literally make disposition calls on different types of content in your organization. All right, we're a little over half of you have voted, so thank you all for contributing. We're almost there.
Sandy,
go ahead.
While we're waiting, just really quick, we did have one person ask if the slides we made available. Just a reminder that we'll send an email out after the session in the next day or so to all of those who registered with a link to the recording. I don't know, Sandy, if last time we included the slide deck as well, but we certainly could do that.
I think we did, Julie.
Any of this. Yeah. Rest assured, if you missed any of it or, want to get that checklist, which, if I were you, I would, it will be coming to you. And if for some reason you don't receive that email, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to give it to you.
Okay, and there was another question that came in, which we can answer while people are finishing up that poll.
Okay. While we're doing this, it's a great question. This one's from Lee Isaacs, who I've known for many, many years, and as a dear friend. It's a great question. So we've talked already about kind of chopping up the work by department or something like that, rather than trying to boil the ocean in the context of the content. or the volume of the content, but this question is a variation on that. So she asked, if you're trying to accomplish several things, such as data reduction, organization, policy application, et cetera, and you can't do all of them at the same time, what's the best order to go in?
I have a vote.
I think our vote might be the same thing.
My thought is to start with data reduction, because that makes every other subsequent effort that you try at least that much smaller. So, and it's just a relatively simple, you don't really need a tremendous amount of SME. There are simple data reduction things, you know, basic rot that you can identify that pretty much everyone would agree on. And you don't necessarily have to get rid of it entirely, because that makes people nervous. You can just kind of sequester it or suppress it from other use cases. So that, if you could only do one thing, I would start there.
Karen, what do you think?
I would agree, and the efforts that you put in that direction are still going to be available for you to take the next step, which once you understand what kind of data you have, that's going to inform how you want to organize it and what kind of policies you're going to create surrounding it.
So yeah, I think we all agree generally on that, although I'll add this. Always check that against what your organization is actively caring about. So if there's an existing initiative, maybe going to the cloud or a technology upgrade or some sort of compliance concern or litigation, take that into consideration as a starting point, and maybe consider something like that. I agree that, you know, data reduction is important, but sometimes if the budget is somewhere else and you can't convince them that data reduction is worth the time and the money, start with something that somebody actually cares about. So just another thought on that. Good point though, Lee. You can't do it all at the same time. It's too complex in any size organization to try and make those kinds of different decisions about content all at the same time. You have to have a process. And so using something like that checklist and tweaking it to your advantage to match what you're trying to do and your organization's tolerance for all of this stuff should be a big help.
I'll actually add something to that, which is if you're thinking about essentially multiple uses and therefore a kind of extended time frame for engagement with this type of technology, you probably want to look for scenarios that involve a kind of simple, easy licensing strategy of the technology. Things that are more kind of heavily project-oriented, you're going to, if you have to space out your efforts, you're going to wind up paying a lot, because you're going to go project, and have to pay each time. Whereas if you can find sort of a steady licensing structure, and then you have to phase out the work, that's probably going to be more cost-effective for you over time.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'll say too, you'd mentioned doing a PSC. In my years doing this kind of work, I will say that it's always shocking to an organization to see all of the details in their data. Doesn't matter which data it is, how much it is. It's really shocking and eye-opening. And so, you know, anytime you can find the opportunity to introduce this kind of technology into your organization and get some stakeholders in front of their data, it's a really compelling event, and you know, could be the thing that gets you that champion that you need to get your first project started.
I've shared the poll results with all of you, so hopefully you can see that. This is similar to last time with trying to just identify and understand the data that we have being the number one. That was true last time as well. I actually have one more poll if people can stand one more question. We'd love to know the kind of roles that you have in your organization. So I'm going to put up one more poll for you. Let us know kind of what you do. And there you go. So if you guys would let us know kind of what your functional area is, just to see kind of who's visiting us today. I didn't see any other questions on there. If you have a burning question or even a less burning question, now is the time to submit that. And we'll be sure to answer that. And If not, then we'll probably wrap it up shortly after this quiz.
And I'll just chit chat over the top of it. I'm super excited about the next one. Well, I'm excited about all of them, but the next one is so exciting to me because I think that one of the challenges we've had in the last 5 years or so since this technology has really matured enough to be useful is the application of rules. There are lots of technologies, frankly, out there in the world that can help you get insight and generate some context, but there aren't a lot that can do a good job at then translating that into an action. And so for those of you who are with us today, please put on your calendar and join us for the next one. As a records manager, some of my colleagues some of my family and friends really find it strange that records managers like to throw things away. But I really do. I get a lot of joy out of it. And so, having a technology available to you that can take your policies and execute against them without having to look at each of those things yourself is really exciting to me. So make sure we join that.
All right, and here's who we have on board today. Pretty even split between RIM or InfoGov folks and e-discovery type folks, and a handful of other ones as well. So again, very similar to last time. We're almost 50-50 between those two areas, which is not surprising. So they're basically coming together.
Yeah, we've seen this convergence happening for a while, for sure.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I think we're at the end. So as the cruise director, I'll wrap us up. So again, thank you to all of you who joined us, and a big thank you to Karen and to Sandy for sharing your insights today. I think it was another good session that built upon the last one. So again, for anyone on the call who didn't have a chance to watch the first one, it is available. We'll make sure that we have a link to that one in the email we send out as well, so you can watch both back if you'd like. Again, join us on the next one, which is in March. We'll be sending emails out, and both Epic and Valora will be at Legal Tech. So if any of you are there, please reach out and say hi. We'd love to meet you, hear what you've got working in your organizations, and share advice, hints, or tips if there's anything we can do to help you. So thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.